Dr. Lewis is an orgone therapist in private practice, trained by my former therapist, Dr. Sobey. He runs the co-director of this institute with Dan Schiff. He's been doing this for a long time, and he is also on the faculty of the New School. He has a half hour to talk about the development of orgone therapy, the American period. So this will be a natural and nice follow-up to my taking you into Oslo. He'll bring us to New York and beyond. And I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes to go. Okay? I'll give you 5.
I mean, to finally get clear, the movement to the Reich comes to the United States in, I always have my quick page, so of course our historian can always correct this. Basically in 1939. Many of you know the history, just quickly. Driven out, having to run ahead of the Nazi onslaught to Scandinavia, and eventually the onslaught follows him into Scandinavia. He has the choice of going to England, where Neil is urging him to go, and the United States, where he has a number of key figures like Wolff and Brill, who Professor Bennett introduced, key figures who are willing to support him both economically, and centrally he gets a appointment with the aid of Brill, but particularly through the intercession of Branislaw Malinowski, another figure who is very, very important here, who often doesn't get looked at closely enough in relation to Reich. Branislaw Malinowski, many of you might know, was the founder of modern anthropology, otherwise might be called that, but Malinowski really is the one who introduces the concept of a functional anthropology, functional cultural anthropology. And the terms I thought rather synergistic and interesting. Malinowski had been excoriated by various henchmen, particularly Roheim, who was a student who was the anthropological representative of Freud, and Ernst Jones, who was the ultimate assassin for Freud, and we know increasingly. Basically, Malinowski and Reich, it hasn't really been explored, had a very, I don't know whether in the archives of both, it'd be very interesting to look at the correspondence. There appeared to have been a very deeply affectionate and respectful relationship between the two. Malinowski clearly, even towards the when Reich began to get into trouble, constantly expressed shock that anyone would take it, to that extreme. He thought Reich was really onto something. And there's a book that often doesn't get talked about by Reich, except with some of us, which is the Invasion of Compulsory Sex Morality, which was directly in response to key works and key ideas of Malinowski.
There is correspondence. It's in the Yale Library, and I have copies of it.
That's great.
And I'll share one little piece with you if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Malinowski was at Yale. He also taught a course as an adjunct at the New
School. Right.
I went to the New School archives, and I found that he and Reich taught on the very same night.
Right.
So you can imagine Malinowski coming down on the train from New Haven, and then them going out and having beers and whatever.
Yeah. Reich was fond, as a number of people who knew him, he was fond of whiskey. And felt it was and interestingly, felt it was a very healthy, thing to open up. He and Neil, as an old Scotsman, loved to, when they did get together, sit and finish a bottle off, evidently. So they were quite. And Dr. Sobey said that when you came to any kind of event that wasn't strictly conference, that Reich would always, start off with a drink. So, if you read the letters of Neil and Reich, you get a much clearer sense of Reich as a real person who was not at all. And so, in transition to what happens in America, is very often a number of people people who knew him in Europe, comment on how in America he became much more formal. Started wearing a white coat. He would not let anyone call him by his first name. He insisted that all members of the group be referred to as doctor or by title. And he was very clear that he had decided to do this. There are references in letters and journals. They decided to do this because he felt this would create some distance and potentially prevent people from beginning to denigrate and undermine the work by trivializing it. Because in Europe and through the whole European thing, almost everyone he worked closely with he was always known as Willy. So Ilse Lichtenberg, in a video of her talking about him, it's very interesting. After 7 years, she basically remembers him as, oh, he was such a sweet boy. He really was such a sweet, I remember him. But she doesn't talk about him with any great deal of sense of intimacy, whether that was burned out by the war and the separation. But his sense of her was crucial, obviously, as it's come out. So the issue is now, where Dr. Bennett has left us, is with Reich working in developing vegetotherapy, which is where he leaves it really in Oslo. And my sense of the group in Oslo, as I've dealt with them and interacted with them, is that they're very honest, very fine working, but they are really stuck in vegetotherapy. And that has a lot to do also with the other key figure, Nick Valle, who is a close friend and associate who helped develop the practice of vegetotherapy and remained the key figure in the psychiatric and psychoanalytic and developmental psychology movement and child psychology movement in Norway and other parts of Scandinavia. That remains fairly much fixed. They have a much harder time dealing with what we come to call, and what Reich comes to call, orgonomy, and he moves away from the term vegetotherapy. Possibly Phil Bennett can date it. I mean, he's still using that term and goes to that term, I think, when he comes to the States. At some point, it gets dropped or gets basically seen as subsumed under the practice of orgone therapy or orgonomy. I think the key factor here is that in the year, while all this is going on in Oslo and other parts of Scandinavia, Reich is also actively pursuing his bioelectrical experiments, what leads to the discovery of the orgone, and basically beginning to deal with the origins of life and the nature of energy and what this energy is and the discovery of this energy and its deeper atmospheric and biological interactions. So this is all present by the time he comes to the States in 1939. He's beginning to transition. And as is often the case with Reich, and you see this again with all these great progenitors, these protean thinkers, people like Freud, Darwin, Marx, that they are often, many others, and these are key figures in relation to Reich. By the time Reich is in the States and people are just beginning to digest and come to terms with what he was calling vegetotherapy, he was already off and running, further out ahead and developing new ideas and beginning to organize it differently. And so the group what initially happens is a small group that continues with him, and he had a tendency to feel that if you couldn't continue with him, that was fine, as long as you didn't profess to be, part of his group, or approved of by him. So there are a few that stay with him. Wolf stays with him pretty much to the end, even though they have some difficulty towards the end of Wolf's life. Wolf died very young from heart complications. At the same time, to be aware that the other interesting issue is Fenichel and the role of Fenichel, and Andy Pink, his first wife, are actively involved, along with a number of other figures who come from the European circles around Reich from this period, in undermining and spreading really murderous and just destructive lies and rumors about Reich, probably which are the real source more than, it's easy to look at the Eddy affair and, the attack of the FDA is suddenly being the one thing that brought Reich down. But actually the groundwork was really set by the radical groups like around Fenichel and Marcuse, among others. Erich Fromm, who turns out to be one of the great villains of the role, who actively told lies about Reich, and this is all documented, and actively stole parts of Reich's work and refused to acknowledge where it came from. And literally told people not to go to see Reich, not to have anything to do with him. He was psychotic. I mean, the psychotic rumor turns out to be fairly directly traceable to Erich Fromm, which I think is interesting. That said, and that groundwork laid, Reich, on the other hand, while he often would complain about these kinds of things and become furious, really didn't pay too much attention from what we can understand. He basically began to build a new movement. He had this pattern that's been described by a number of people who knew him to Ilse Ohlendorf, I think his second, well, I guess his third wife, really, his second legal wife, would often say he had this quality, and other people that knew him, Dr. Sobey, Dr. Handelman, others like Michael Rothenberg, who I was close with, Dr. Schiff trained with, said that, and Dr. Herskovitz down in, who's still he's the last of the last, 94 this year, and he was the last one trained by Reich who's still practicing. And they all said that Reich had this quality of taking, a defeat or taking attack very, very deeply, and he would be really just sort of devastated and go into often a deep kind of withdrawal, maybe a depression, and then he would process it and push out again, and then reorganize and push out with even greater, clarity and greater function until the end, when he just obviously couldn't. It finally got to him. So what happens is he comes to the United States. He's ostensibly brought here to lecture as to be an adjunct lecturer in medical psychiatry at the New School. By all accounts, the other thing that I often point out is it's very often misunderstood that Reich's courses were extreme. Reich was sort of a superstar at that time. The people around who remember that period this was like the ticket that you wanted to get. If you were interested in any of this stuff, you wanted to get to hear Reich. And there were many, many young people coming to study with Reich who were interested in psychoanalysis. They were interested in what Reich's ideas were about more than mainstream psychoanalysis as it was developing in the United States. This also probably has a great deal to do with various conflicts and movements. Okay, so at this point, in terms of bringing it back to somatic psychology, which is the theme here rather than just history, Reich has now had this incredible experience of understanding the breakthroughs that Freud sets in motion, and Frienzi contributes to. Frienzi is the unsung and often forgotten figure in all of this. He was a very, very amazingly gifted analyst and psychologist, and but unlike many others, probably what destroyed him was his generosity. He was an extremely open and generous individual by all accounts. Reich begins to process this, certainly, we've seen the history of the development of character analysis and the emergence of his idea of working physically on the body. What I think is very important that's come out in Professor Bennett's presentation and is beginning to emerge is how much Reich was responding to what was going on around him, rather than just simply. And interestingly, if you read someone like Frank Sulloway, who's a favorite historian of the history of ideas, who wrote a brilliant book on Freud called Freud and Biologists of the Mind, he points out that Freud was one of these figures who tended to present himself as coming up with his ideas alone, in isolation, with no reference to anyone. He was the first person to ever think about this. In fact, this is not true. And I think this was also true of Reich, that Reich had a tendency to see himself as the central, sort of hero out alone, very this Nietzschean kind of. They were all very, very centrally affected by Nietzsche. The role of Nietzsche in all of this is is maybe as important as Descartes in some ways, in other ways. This idea of Zarathustra out on the mountaintop, suddenly having this truth and taking it forward. But Reich takes all of this, combines all of this, and now with the work that has been done in the discovery of the nature and function of the orgasm and the elaboration of that, because it's not just that Reich embraces things that come from Freud about sexuality and the function of sexuality and even the function of the orgasm. Reich actually studies it and looks at it in material scientific mode. He does what Freud suggested someone would do, which is essentially begin to study this and understand it and present a cohesive, coherent model. And Reich has done that. In the process, he's begun to discover this energy that he cannot, initially thinks is bioelectrical energy, biochemical energy. He cannot avoid the conclusions that this is some sort of other kind of energetic function, which he then begins to elaborate and study. And again, we can't go in, it's just too extensive to cover it here, but just to lay out the pieces. The next step is he begins to look for ways of accessing and studying and responding to this growing connection between the already established body of character analytic knowledge, the established body and practice of vegetotherapy in terms of the physical embodiment in the organism, and how does this interact with this energetic function? As he begins to understand this energetic function, and as he comes to identify this energy and give it the name orgone energy, he begins to think about how and what is going to happen in terms of practice, because he now understands, I think, very clearly, and he writes about this once he's in America, that what's really happening in the organism, in each individual, in all living organisms, is pulsation. And it's a pulsation, not an imaginary pulsation, and not a bioelectrical pulsation, but a literal function of the living, as he called it. The expressive language of living is a very important work in relation to that Dr. Bennett has referenced. He begins to not only experiment with this, but he begins to move further and further away, and this is covered largely in his work that has been published in his journals from this period called Beyond Psychology, in which he begins to look at the fact that, and this is often misinterpreted as Reich rejecting psychology. This is not the case at all, okay? What he is simply saying is, and I will later refer to it in more detail, but what he is simply saying, all these fancy things. I like chalk.
It's chalk.
Whatever. Well, this doesn't work, so that's...
Okay.
So what he's simply saying is that psychology, unlike Freud, what Freud had begun to do, is not the central functioning building block. It's biology, or the biophysical, is the central function of the organism. That inevitably becomes organized in a socio-cultural context, which he clearly has now gotten very clear about, not only from studying Marx and from studying particularly people, interacting with people like Fenichel, but also people like Malinowski, that every living human being gets born into a society and is cultural and so this biology is organized, maybe sublimated, maybe repressed, it depends on where and how you're organized. But that produces psychology. So psychology is not a insignificant function. It is the experiential expression of this process. And what's interesting is, as when Dr. Weitzner was responding earlier, that the issue of internal and external becomes crucial here, because what psychology is for Reich is the organizing of internal perceptions to this process as it goes on. And this, of course, doesn't go on. Reich is very clear to mention, as he develops his ideas of orgonomy, that this does not go on in the way I just laid it out as separate tracks. It goes on totally simultaneous. So I asked a student at the new school, I taught at the new school, I teach at the new school, but they never did it. It was one of the art students from Pratt, I mean from Parsons, to build me a neon sign in which basically you have body, you know, behavior, psychology, mind, you know, and that's what it looks like. And maybe every once in a while the light blinks on and off, you know, and body sort of peaks. But it really looks like mud. It looks like just you know a congealing of the whole.
Did they build it?
No. Parsons students are notoriously uninterested in anything too experimental. But so that becomes really, although Reich doesn't lay out this grid, that's my grid, but it comes from Reich, what Reich is presenting at that time. And clearly that, I think, is where the issue of psychosomatic psychology, or the psychosomatic therapy, or the issue of psyche and soma becomes central to, is put into play. What is now happening in terms of the introduction of this concept of psychosomatic psychology is the fact that, as Reich said, people will come to my work or come to these ideas and they will resurface and be reprocessed and used and picked at. But what is largely lacking is the organization of this kind of functional identity. Functional identity, as Reich constantly reminds us, is that essentially things are functionally identical in that we can talk about the body, but at the same time, which is what I think Dr. Weitzner was trying to point out too. You can talk about the body, but you're not. When you talk about the body, it is simply the organism, and the mind is not separate from body. It is body. It is just a question of where you decide to come in. Okay. So, in keeping with this and his understanding of the literal nature of this energy, which he calls Orgone energy, and the fact that this energy he begins to discover this energy can literally and materially be accumulated as he experiments with this. He begins to consider, how and what and exactly where. He's already been doing this, but at some point, possibly Dr. Bennett has the actual historical data. At some point, he begins to realize that you can, he needs to start working on techniques, many of which have already been there, that allow this pulsation to be freed as much as possible. He's very, very clear, which is one of the saddest things about people who have picked up on Reich's work in part or in piecemeal, is Reich makes it very clear that this is dynamite. You get the organism pulsating, you get the organism moving, you better know very clearly how and what to do when it starts really pulsating. Because if you don't, you're setting in motion disaster and catastrophe. He would often comment, and everyone that worked with Reich said this was always the thing. He would come into his meetings with his doctors and say, "How's it going? How is your practice?" And they would say, "Oh, fine." He said, "It's not going that well, I'm sure." And they said, "What do you mean?" He said, "If you were really getting it moving, you would be reporting suicides, you would be reporting," and I'm not being flip, you would be reporting suicides, breakdowns, hospitalizations. He said, it means that and that's good that it's not going as well as you think it's going. He would say gradual, Dr. Sobey always says, gradual is best. Now that's interesting considering Reich was seldom, if ever, gradual in his own character, in his own structure. But I think he had great insight into the fact that the danger was that most of us are not capable of tolerating major release of pulsation, expansion, and contraction in the organism and its impact. He is clearly aware, and people often ask, well, what would he be aware, what would he be doing with the new breakthroughs in immunology, new breakthroughs in genetics, basically Reich dies just at the point where it all starts breaking loose in terms of this massive knowledge of neurosciences, the massive breakthroughs in cellular biology, et cetera, et cetera. My response has always been, I think Reich would have loved it. It would have just been more information, more data to begin to process and organize around this basic common functioning principle of pulsation, which becomes more and more central to him. and leads to the organizing of what becomes orgone treatment and orgone science, the orgonomic science being the study of the actual function of this energy and pulsation, but more specifically in treatment, which he became less and less interested in himself, by all accounts, except to teach and train therapists because he needed to finance much of what his other research. But basically, what emerges is what we now call orgone therapy. Basically, the fundamental, the fundamental idea that at the core of every living organism, human or otherwise, is essentially, Dr. Schiff is often referred to, pulsation, expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. And that in one sense, the fundamental function in orgone therapy is to get the organism, and Reich was also fond of saying, it doesn't matter how you do it. So a lot of the concepts, you got to breathe, you got to do this, you got to do that, you lie in this position, lie in that position, is not the way Reich worked. When the doctors got together at one point after they thought he was dead long enough to share with each other, Dr. Sobel was always fond of that, and Handelman concurred. Reich had a strict rule, you could not talk about your own therapy. So the orgonomists, after he died, wouldn't violate that rule for about 6 months, and then finally one evening it all sort of broke loose and they started sharing their memories of the therapy. And they all sat there, and the two things that emerged, that not one of them had a memory of the same therapy, right? And not one of them could remember how tall Reich was. Some thought that he was over 6 foot tall, others thought he was small. It was a very fascinating introduction to this group of very clear observers as to what their experience was. So the point is that orgone therapy seems to be the culmination of this idea of the central theme of the fact that that functional identity is crucial. Psyche and soma are not independent functions. They are simply specific functions of the total organism. And that if you're not going to understand brain function, I've had arguments and debates at the New School with neurologists and neuroscientists, talking about ultimately the reason neuroscience continuously gets stuck on some level with all the great breakthroughs, which are wonderful, is that they don't come to a place where it all becomes organized in terms of how it becomes functional in the environment, in the interpersonal world. Some of the attachment people, which I will talk about later, are struggling with this. They still do not have a central organizing principle. The central organizing principle, which is what becomes orgone treatment, is the management and facilitating of increased capability of the organism tolerating this pulsation. And through that, the organizing of what Reich would call the function of the orgasm. But what most people tend to identify as the function of the orgasm is sex. And that, Reich is very clear, is not what the function of the orgasm is. Sex acts, and sexuality can be anything you want it to be, in any way you want it to be. That is not the function of the orgasm. So last comment here, and Dr. Sobey's anecdote is that when a patient comes in and he took a sexual history, which we always do, and the person says, oh, I have sex all the time. I have sex 3-4 times a night. Reich would say you're treating impotence.
You're what?
Treating impotence. You're not treating healthy sexual function. That energetically pulsation, if it is facilitated and enabled, will take care of itself in terms of genital activity, assuming that it's available. The big question, and people raise the issue of politics, is if you live in a society where you get the organism open enough to pulsate and have a healthy genital love life, how do you supply the ability? Where is it?
Where do you go do that?
Yeah, where is it and who's available? And finally, you get a patient, or any of us get healthy enough to pulsate that much, you don't probably in this society you don't make it down to the corner, before you're wiped out by something. So we need to understand that, and I assume my 5 minutes is.
Well, yeah, your time is up, but that's okay.
So I mean, and the problem is the issue is here is orgone therapy, or the role of orgone therapy, and I think clearly Orgone therapy is all of the above, everything that's led up to historically in this discussion and everything that Dr. Schiff is saying about somatic psychology. What it seems to me to end, sort of coming back to where Dr. Schiff started, is that Reich said that after he was dead, they would pick at the pieces of his work and pick out what was useful and eventually maybe rediscover the central issues. What I don't see happening yet, Dr. Schiff is much more optimistic than I am, but he's from the West Coast, even though he used to be a Brooklyn boy. Is that this function of pulsation and energetic function is not central to the more academic or established ideas of somatic psychology. Some of the, and then the additional problem in the alternate groups, the more spin-off groups around from Reich's work, is that they often miss the centrality. I mean, Lowen was very clear. Lowen desexualized a lot of Reich's ideas. It's clear, it's in his writing. He minimalized it. He doesn't reject it. He says, oh, it's there, but it's,
And Caracas sexualized everything.
No, John Caracas also mystified everything.
Right.
He was until the end. He was talking to his wife, who was dead. So he was channeling her. So I mean, this was always, in Reich's terms, this was always where it goes once you lose the anchor, and that's the last thing, real last thing. Once you lose the anchor of pulsation and energetic function, and the function of the orgasm in that way, you don't have a way of understanding, neurological function. You don't have a way of understanding none of the neurology, biology, physiology, immunology are all centrally various functional expressions of this physical and this physical organism pulsating in the world.
Work with this little coterie of therapists? How did he train them? No one could have been more different than Sobey and him.
Yeah, well, he trained them largely in I think the same way. The difference was the best insight you can get to that. I would refer to, you can get from the museum is there's a series of 6 hour or so lectures of Reich in seminar with the doctors, right. And you get a very real sense of how he worked. The first thing that's most striking in listening to Reich is he's always saying things like, he's constantly repeating, I didn't know that. That's interesting. That's new to me. So you really get this sense, as I think Dr. Bennett already presented, that Reich was, while could be difficult in certain ways, he was extremely open to new ideas and new things and very interested in what others had to say. And how he trained, essentially, they all went into treatment with him. And some of them he told they could not be in practice because they didn't feel they were healthy enough, functional enough to work with patients. It's very disturbing to find out who many of those people were, who later became leading spokespeople for various groups and various...
What about Dr. Baker? Where is he in all this?
Well, Dr. Baker is that's a big problem. Reich at different times, I think this relates back to also what Dr. Bennett was saying. Reich both was extremely clear about who he would support and who he wouldn't support. He was also in great need of support and people who seemed to understand. He was very vulnerable, in my view, to particularly people who seemed to get his work and get him and were very enthusiastic, and he was easily seduced, I think, in many ways, as many of them were, Freud, Marx, others. Darwin seems to be the one guy who was able to resist, because he stayed away in his farm. But Baker, for a while, was a favorite of Reich's. But Reich at the end felt he was too rigid and was not really the one to carry on with the work. And at the end, the last thing he said to Dr. Sobey, and that's the last thing I'll say, is just do the work. And Dr. Handelman confirmed that too. Just do the work. If you get a chance to pass it on a little bit, what you know, that's good, but don't build big organizations.
That's it. That's it.
Dr. Weitzner and I worked with Dr. Sobey, so he can concur that was kind of things that Sophie said.
Well, yeah, of course. That is what Dr. Sobey told us. Dr. Sobey told us, right, there was not supposed to be any one leader to take over after Reich was gone. He told us we shouldn't be in it for the money.
Right.
I wish I could say something profound about this subject. What I really want to know is how tall was Reich?
5'10".
5'10"?
So he was fairly
Is that
tall.
right?
Well, according to the FBI, he was 5'10". I don't know.
Well, they must be right.
Well, the only other comment I have is that
Well, can I just say one thing? He must have worked differently with each one of them.
That's right.
Because each one of them was so different from the
Right.
others.
Well, that's certainly what he would say. And he would also say, as far as technique, there are no techniques. There is just, if you hit someone
Yeah,
with
right.
if you hit someone with a hammer and it works, that's the technique.
yeah, well, that
Yeah.
reminds me of something I was thinking when Dr. Bennett was speaking, which is that, from speaking as a contemporary psychoanalyst, one of the things that Reich was doing, which has been incorporated into psychoanalysis, whatever you think of it, is the flexibility. I mean, it's
Right.
now recognized that you cannot be as rigid, just listening behind the couch. There has to be an interaction. The transference cannot remain an abstraction for too long before you have to get engaged. So, I mean, that's also been incorporated. It's something which I knew a long time ago. But going back to what Dr. Lewis has been talking about, it's really fascinating to try to understand how the Reich's original character analysis developed into orgone therapy. And the way he recounts it, I mean, there were certain crucial moments of discovery when, for example, when he suddenly was hit with the inevitability of the idea that there was some physical energy involved, and then later on when he was hit by the inevitable idea that this energy was a cosmic energy, not just an organismic energy. But what I'd like to go back to is the original psychoanalytic practice of Reich. Dr. Lewis was saying how dangerous it is if you could reestablish pulsation. Well, Reich was already writing in the 1930s about how dangerous it was if you could really break through somebody's character armor. And in character analysis, he says you have to be very careful about provoking, suicidal behavior and psychological breakdowns if you are successful in dismantling certain kinds of character structures.
That you go slow. It's very fascinating historically. Most people who don't know Reich, and in his recent horrible book, questionable book, or whatever we want to call it, by this guy Turner on Reich, I won't even deign to use the title.
I'm glad you brought it up.
But in which essentially this idea that Reich was this smasher, this blasting ahead, blowing up. Two incidents. One is that Reich is constantly going back to character analysis, reminding and warning that this is dynamite and you have to be very careful, and gradual is always better. Gradual is always better, and really keep staying that course, really just working to build enough, getting the organism capable of tolerating just a little bit more than they could tolerate before, so that the expansion doesn't overwhelm. And Reich was very interested always. He was one for in seminar. Yes, how he trained. You were only allowed to bring in your mistakes or your problems. You could not present anything that you were successful with, okay? Because he said, if you're coming in telling us how well you did, that means you're coming in to brag about yourself, and that's not.
Well, that was also something he started as a psychoanalyst.
That's right.
He started the technical seminar.
That's right.
As a way of focusing on mistakes. But also, the other thing that characterized Reich as an analyst and distinguished him from all of the other analysts was the focus on energy, the focus on the so-called economics or quantitative point of view in psychoanalysis. But this remarkable transformation you have to orgone therapy, I mean, what can you say? I mean, it's really, I think, the transformation from the point of view of biology and psychology to the point of view of biology and some kind of overarching physical principle. So you have the idea that on the one hand there is, maybe this is not right, but I can only conceptualize it as pure energy which pulsates, and on the other hand you have the energy can freeze and become matter. And that matter, mysteriously, tends sometimes to take the form of an organism, beginning with a cell, with a membrane, and the pulsation within the cell, and then the pulsation of the entire organism. And Reich begins to have this vision of a living organism pulsating in concert with the entire cosmos. So the entire cosmos becomes like a living organism. So the world becomes alive. I don't know how else to put it. Now, and we're still, I think, very far from working out this idea.
Except mystically.
And well, forget about mysticism. It's already been done mystically in many different versions, which I think are admirable as fantasies.
And so did Reich. They were
But we're still very far from working this out as a potential scientific idea.
That's the key. That we haven't worked it out as and that's, I think, the central thing that comes back to what Dr. Schiff was trying to get at, too.
I want to inject very quickly one other element. The other thing that distinguished Reich from the very beginning from his colleagues was that they were thinking scientifically according to their own paradigm, the existing paradigms, and Reich was thinking dialectically. Right. But Freud was to a certain extent too, but but Reich was specifically, I think, and I'd be curious to know if Philip agrees and to what extent, Reich was taking the method of dialectical materialism, as he learned it from Marx and Engels, and applying it to biology and psychology.
Yeah.
And then at some point he modified it to make it more workable and less tied to a frozen kind of Marxism.
Yeah, I think you see this very clearly in De Bione, in the book on the Bion, it's the Bion experiment.
So,
and he later reframes dialectical materialism as functionalism. He comes to call
I
it.
think we have to take that into account when we evaluate Freud's scientific work, that he's using this model and trying to adapt it to the biology and psychology
Right.
that he's studying.
May I suggest that we leave some room for
Yeah.
questions from the floor? Questions or comments?
Does Dr. Schiff have anything to say?
Oh, well, just to say that when we talk about going gradual, slow, we don't only need anecdotes of that. Reich is very clear about that in his article on his work with a schizophrenic patient, which is published in Character Analysis. And as I kind of use that as a teaching tool in training, as we go over it step by step, he returns to that theme again and again and again in terms of the gradual bringing up of energy, allowing for expansion, and then the discharge, and then staying back, going to where you were before, not going too fast. And it's always struck me about this one hand, this representation of Reich as this armor smasher, you know, which may have been at a certain time, I don't know, and the way he portrays therapy, at least in those articles and in that particular article. It's a total contrast.
You brought up one of the things that I wondered about in terms of the newer therapies and the mindfulness and meditation and all of that, without, you know, that they don't develop the pulsation. And it magically like there's, and yet, of course, thank God they're going slow, because I think it would be absolutely a mess. But that is the one issue I have. You know, that's one of the issues anyway. I have.
Right, and I'll address that in my last
Great.
talk.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, in the awful film, but interesting film, the Machiavellian film, W.R. Mysteries of the Organism, Machiavellian interviews Dr. Lowen, and then there's a clip of people in a Lowen workshop in these stress positions, and they're vibrating and stuff like that. And The way some people in Germany have interpreted Reich's view is using these stress positions, and it seems to me that that can be very dramatic in a good way to attract people to your way of thinking, because wow, this weird, wild stuff is going on, but it can also be incredibly damaging if you're not moving slowly, and if you're liberating energy, say, lower down in the body, you know, and not having it integrated, it could easily lead to some kind of schizophrenic split, the way Reich talks about schizophrenia. So I think this emphasis on gradualism versus drama, you know, you get those legs switching and wow, what is this stuff? I think has to be emphasized because there are so many people who say they're doing, quote, Reichian therapy, who are doing an amalgam of stuff that's quite different from what Reich had in mind. And I think the best exemplars are, well, I think you're one of the good exemplars. I've never experienced therapy with Dr. Herskowitz, but I did have some therapy with Dr. Sobey, and I do recall this, that the drama was not the point.
So we would often say when you had, I remember the first session I had with somebody began, I was like, oh, this is, you know. And he said, and he just sort of said, 10 minutes, you'll be out of here 10 minutes, it'll be nothing. You know, you won't even, you'll start romanticizing it, you'll start being sentimental about it. He said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so there wasn't this kind of sense that there was this big drama. Remember Dr. Rothenberg, who trained Dr. Schiff, but also had worked with Reich, and who I worked with for a while, would always say that, you know, Reich would say, you know, there's good psychoanalysis, there's good, you know, the issue is, does it get things moving? And does it get things moving in a way that can be sustained? Not drama. You know, you want to do drama, that's what lines them up. I mean, the first time I saw Lowen, he was on an afternoon talk show, you know, and he took people from the audience and said, come on up here. Got them bent over and doing it. Aren't you feeling great? Oh, yes, I'm feeling wonderful. He said, see? Cure. And he actually said that. See? A stranger from the, it was like, you know, a stranger from the audience, I've cured her. She's open. You know? And I was trying to think, what? You know, I came back to Sobey and he said, yeah, she's open, but, you know,
This is one of the problems
What
with
about the
Turner,
next
is that
minute?
Turner found someone, quote, a orgonomist, who gave him sessions. And again, like 3 sessions, and Turner, on the basis of these 3 sessions with a doctor who would remain nameless, he's going to tell you what orgone therapy is about. And I'm trying to imagine 3 sessions, like how well you get to know your patient. In 3 sessions, how well you get to understand their history. How well you get to really understand their character. And it would probably was all this drama kind of stuff. And yeah, that's, whoever said that was speaking correctly, but I didn't want to say it.
You talked, Dr. Weitzner, you talked about the qualitative and the quantitative. In dialectical materialism, that's a big question. How do you transform one into the other? And I'm wondering, for all of you in Reich's thought, if we think about the qualitative, maybe it's a mistake on my part, as people's history, the range of their emotional experience, and then the quantitative is the actual characteristic of the energy. So how do you move back and forth between those in your understanding of Reich's dialectical method?
That's a tough
I'm glad
one.
he gave you that question.
Well, Reich did explicitly say, even when he was a psychoanalyst, that he had discovered the importance of form over content. So that when the form is you can think of it in energy terms, I think, as the way the energy is organized or structured. And there's no question that there's a lot of important content that we take into us from our experiences, our experiences with our parents, our families, with society. You know, memories are frozen, frozen experiences, frozen energy that we store somehow, and that doesn't remain static in reality, and keeps changing and evolving. But I think in my view, you can never work with one without the other. You have to be aware of the quality and how much quantity it represents, or vice versa. If you have a quantum of energy, what meanings does it take on?
And I guess what's problematic for me, the reason I'm sorry to ask the question, is that it would seem that such varied human experiences could be reduced to a single form, that of energy. One would think that different qualitative experiences would have different quantitative measures and different qualitative characteristics. So, you know, I've always felt like a tension between what I see as reductionism in one sense and holism in another.
Can I respond to that? Just quickly, the error I think there is that it's not reduced to one. The functioning principle is simply the functioning principle. And pulsation is simply, you know, a reality it's our roots in nature. It's a natural, or in certain ways, cosmic function. So the issue of quantitative and qualitative only really becomes operative when we move beyond that basic functioning principle and look at interpersonal, and we'll talk more about this, my interest and my movement towards interest in attachment as I began to develop my own thinking was largely to begin to understand how both qualitatively and quantitatively we begin to organize this basic functioning principle. I think what Reich's contribution is spectacular is that he identifies this common functioning, this natural functioning principle. Right? The issue of how you access it in any one given patient or one given individual or in yourself is a much more complicated thing than even Reich himself was fully able to examine. That's why Reich remained deeply, you know, committed to issues like things like music, dance, art, poetry, other creative functions, because often those offered more of the answers in terms of individuals than science. Science basically presents us with information and knowledge. What that specifically means for you, me, or anyone else is a much more complicated.
And we have to be mindful of our lunch hour. We're already 10 minutes into it.
I would say, I assume this will be addressed by Dr. Schiff also, but read Psychic Contact and Vegetative Streaming as an example of how Reich analyzes the problem of quantity and how it expresses itself in the individual.
We're about to do something very challenging. We're about to have an hour lunch break in New York City. If you don't know this neighborhood well, walk away from the river towards Hudson Street and you'll find a plethora of places where you can get lunch. We'll reconvene at 20 of 2, and we'll somehow make fine adjustments to our time so we can still end at 3.